Good morning, everyone. That's quite an audience for a 9:45 a.m. session. Both me and Manu were worried yesterday that we might be speaking to empty chairs, but thank you for making it here quite early in the morning. Um, it's nice to be in conversation with Manu. Actually, I met Manu many years ago at this very Lit Fest.
2018.
Yes, and we've been in touch since then. And apart from his books that he has published in the meanwhile, Manu also earned his doctorate recently, not recently, 2022. So it's Dr. Manu Pillai now. So we're getting used to calling him doctor now. So we are going to discuss his latest book, Gods, Guns and Missionaries, The Making of Modern Hindu Identity. And I have a few questions, and I'm sure there are more questions in the audience. So at whatever point, we'll sort of pass the mic to the audience. Manu, just to start off, I just have some questions on the book and some questions about the method and your process of writing. But for those of in the audience who have not probably had the chance to read the book as yet, by a virtue of question, I just wanted to ask you that the brilliant introduction that you have in the book, we also get a sense of how the Hindu identity or Hindu consciousness starts shaping up in especially in the pre-colonial era, as you outline in the first chapter. Um, I wanted to ask to what extent the idea of India also evolved as that identity evolved. You obviously talk about Dynaic's concept of sacred geography, and you to use that, and also talking about the boundaries that kept shifting as the knowledge about rest of the Indian region or the subcontinental region sort of came up. So I was just wondering how that process, like how that notion of Indian geography evolved and how it changed over the period.
I think yesterday we had William Dalrymple give the talk in the evening, right? And if you read his book, he has this one reference somewhere about how when when Alexander invaded India, his army and his people came across a bunch of sadhus in the northwest, and they asked the sadhus to describe their homeland, and they basically described the land between the Indus River and the Bay of Bengal and the Himalayas and the southern seas. So you have some sense that they had, even back then, over 2000 years ago, some sense of a cultural zone of which they were part. I think the mistake we make sometimes is in equating that cultural zone with a sense of being one people, in the sense that today's nationalistic histories will claim that that sense of nationalism stems from there, but not necessarily. Think of it a little bit like Europe, which is that there is something that links it together culturally as a region. There is a shared history at a certain level, threads running through, but there's also a lot of diversity. And not everybody who lived here thought of themselves as one people, even though they may have thought of themselves as people living in one homeland or one shared space. So that's really the India we're talking about initially. Nationalism, etc., comes in much later. So the way we define the Indian nation now or Indianness today is not necessarily how people 2000 years ago defined it, even though there are linkages and genealogies that you can draw between the two. The idea of sacred geography I thought was very interesting because, as the introduction of the book outlines, the Brahmin community plays a very important role in sort of knitting together into a sort of narrative framework a lot of diverse parts of the country. You find Brahmins first moving from the northwest towards the Gangetic belt, so their notion of what is Arya Desha, or the right kind of country for the pure, shifts a little bit in terms of its geographical location. At that time, everything else in India is Mlecha Desha, barbarian country. So Bengal is bad, Sindh is bad, South India is totally bad. You can't even go to these places. To go to these places is to commit sin through the feet. That's the kind of notion that they have about these places. But obviously, human beings don't stick to one place. They start migrating out. And as Brahmin communities spread out across the country, through myth and legend, through uniting various cults, they encounter tribal cults, local gods, groups that worship, images as opposed to the traditional Vedic religion where images were frowned upon. All of this sort of coalesces in a very interesting way, not without contradictions, but it comes together where they try to knit all of this into a common framework. And over a period of time, as Sanskrit becomes a language of the literati in India at one point, like Sanskrit cosmopolis as they used to call it, in that time, people start investing in the shared framework, and there is a sense by this time that, okay, there is a way to connect all of these disparate geographies. The sacred thing becomes important here because people also invest in temples. So as late as the 17th century, there's a missionary who comes to South India, and he's talking to a local Brahmin there who's actually from Goa, a fugitive from Goa called Padmanabha. And he gets a sense of the local sacred geography of Tamil Nadu, where they're talking about Srirangam, Rameshwaram, all of those parts. But they're also aware that there is Kanchi, there is Kashi in the north, there's Dwarka in the west, and so on. So people know that there are these sacred sites that in some ways, again, construct or attempt to construct some kind of a common framework. Then legends like, Shiva's wife Sati and how he dances in agony with her corpse, and then her body parts are sort of flung all over the country. So it includes everything from Kashmir to the northeast, Assam, South India, all kinds of places. So in these legends, you see not necessarily political unity, but some form of a desire or an impulse towards constructing some kind of cultural framework. So I think that's what all of this refers to, which is again not to equate it with the modern nation state, not to equate it with modern boundaries, but to suggest that they had some vague cultural notion that they belong to a common homeland.
We pause for a second. Guys, can I ask the 6 or 8 or 10 of you to sort the uniform, the students to come and sit over here, please? We'll get some more place for them. Can you come, please? People who don't mind sitting on the stage, come down our phones. Please stop looking. That's nice.
Awkward.
It would be nice if you think that this nonsense name is this. Because they do that they show on it. Right?
That's fine.
Then,
I'm flattered. I thought there'd be nobody at 9:45, so
bang. Manu believe first can do that. Yeah. And then
we move it.
that's all. Right? How this again? Probably they are the total. Sean that can so we integrate it. It's done. Then whatever else should I do? It's
That way you can look at that instead of looking at other people.
really good. And we can get sent you just target. So you can idea now that they have so we help seeing the school site for the project or the amount break down allowing the pupil. So one to one get but get to them hearing the like guys who want to go on the scare down so bad state. No people touch purple segments. My gosh, better go. Grant and then you go to dealers using evidence like this industry. Yeah, they're let on the side go. I think that they're doing that. Seeing it, you brought back to like the names to who walk through some work that that contributed to the new actions. Good night. In a contract, a couple of sets, they were going in. Well, wagons down some white something I'm going to apply this here. It could be fired or open plan. This is it. Yeah, you got it. Sunday last time released, they wanted to buy a chair, so we may get a chair for your pocket.
Should we resume?
What? The donkey's what? Funny bird from speak. Well, I know.
I'm not sure.
Oh, first day on. Right.
Okay, are we settling in? Yeah. So we're talking about the idea of sacred geography, and just as a virtue of Manu's response, I thought would also be prudent to ask, like, and so when does this whole fantasy of the Akhand Bharat sort of begins? Like, I'm not trying to say that probably gave rise to it, but the modern notion of Akhand Bharat that people seem to harbor, where does it come from? And also just going back to your first response is like, what would have been probably the ways in which this notion circulated and how? Like,
Akhand Bharat is definitely a very modern phenomenon, and by modern, we're not even talking 18th century onwards. We're talking very recently, post the nation state, 20th century onwards, or maximum maybe some people in the 19th century thought of an Akhand Bharat. But the thing there is that it's not a question of right or wrong. Every generation looks at the same historical material and invests new emotional value in that historical material. So we're constantly interpreting and reinterpreting the past, connecting the dots of the past in different ways based on where we are as a people, as a country, etc. So for example, the same evidence 100 years from now, a future generation may look at very differently. One example I often give is how, 100 years ago, all the historians like Jadunath Sarkar, that generation, none of them noticed the women in the archives. None of them noticed women in history because they were not trained to even imagine women as playing any kind of political roles. So for them, any female figure in history was primarily a domestic figure, or if she was too politically visible, then some kind of negative scheming vamp. Whereas now we know post-feminist perspectives, research, etc., that that same material can be analyzed in a very different way. Now, zoom out and look at these things culturally, and you realize that as cultures become more and more they sort of coalesce together, as they come together, as the idea of the nation emerges, as a sense of one people is developed. And these are all ideas that are developed. These are all imagined identities, as we call them. As that happens, we all look at our history differently. So one set of people is quite happy with the boundaries that we have of the country. Another set of people thinks that no, our ancient glory is Akhand Bharat, extending from Singapore to Afghanistan and beyond, etc., where even Mecca had a Shivalingam in it, etc. You have stories like that. So people invest value in these accounts based on their political position and what they're seeking to build. And that contest, I think, is a very human contest, and you see it throughout history.
And just to go back to the question, like, how do you think that these notions that sort of circulated around this idea of like a singular, not a singular, but like some sort of one region called India?
I think if you look at the current map of India, a lot of it is, I think, a post-British response, in the sense that we have one state coming into the country under the British. Even before, while we had empires and lots of kingdoms, etc., no empire had exactly these boundaries that we have now. So now when we shut our eyes and think of India, we see the map in front of our eyes. That united India is very much a recent phenomenon. But I don't think beyond that there's much point discussing what people thought of the shape of India at an earlier time. For example, even in this whole notion of sacred geography, people in the south may have had some notion of where Kashi is. They know that Kashi is a sacred place and it matters. But if you ask them to point it on a map, they probably wouldn't have known where exactly it was, because you have no idea in that physical sense where exactly a Kashi is located. So that way, you have a notion, but it's not solidified and mapped out in the way that modernity brings to us through technology, etc., that evolves much later.
So the other thing that I found very fascinating is like, because the book is so premised on like the idea of Hinduism and its evolution, I was just wondering to what extent, let's say, people identified certain practices as, let's say, caste practices as opposed to like Hindu practices. What was that degree of variance, or at where did people draw boundaries, or these things merged? What would we have understood as, if I practice vegetarianism, is it a Hindu practice or is it a caste practice?
I think the two can exist simultaneously, in the sense that we again often fall into the trap of an either-or situation, but again, human beings are very contextual. For example, you and I sitting here, if we had to introduce ourselves, I would probably say I'm a Malayali, but I grew up in Maharashtra. You'd say that you're a Goan. But when you and I go to America and someone asks us where are we from, we say we're from India. So both of these identities can be equally true depending on context. So in a certain context, say in a village where there's some kind of acrimony between the Brahmins and the Marathas, the caste identity is what comes to the fore. But say a third party enters and they will find some way of standing together and sort of bracketing themselves as one camp versus the outsider. Power, I think, makes a lot of difference in this. You find that most religious identities develop based on an other. They need somebody to define themselves against. So if you look at the history of Christianity and Judaism, both sort of take form as isms, or as these organized religions playing off each other. If you look at their scriptural corpus, etc., they're essentially stemming out of the same thing. Culturally also, they're stemming out of the same thing. But they play off each other and over a period of time create a sense of distinction. In India, the word Hindu itself, of course, as everybody knows, comes into the country through foreign sources. It's foreign writers who describe people of the country as Hindus. But you also find that very soon, in a couple of centuries, people here start owning that term. So politically, by the 14th century, 1347, you have the Vijayanagara emperors calling themselves Hinduraya Surathrana, which is that sultans among Hindu kings. Where in a world of sultans, because now North India is under sultans, there's Islamic power in the south. On the one hand, they're almost appropriating the title of sultan, but they're also qualifying it by saying we are sultans among Hindu kings. So there's a usage of the word Hindu where they're owning that term. You look at texts, or you look at poetry of Vidyapati in Bihar, I think 14th century, Eknath in Maharashtra, who writes what is called the Hindu-Turk Samvad. He also writes a dialogue between a Brahmin and a Mahar, because that's also true, the Dalit versus the Brahmin, and there's contradictions there that he can spot. But in the Hindu-Turk Samvad, the same writer also has a Hindu, he calls him a Hindu as well, taking pot shots against a Muslim, and the Muslims taking pot shots against the Hindu. So clearly, by Eknath's time at least, by the medieval period at least, as much as people had their caste identities and local identities, they had some notion that you could have two broad sort of master categories in India, which was primarily the Turk or the Muslim and the Hindu. If you look at the poetry of Kabir, when Kabir says that neither the Hindu nor the Turk knows the way to God and I am the one who'll show you Ram, he's also implicitly acknowledging that he sees two broad camps and how like neither of their paths are actually working out. So I think it's possible, therefore, for people to have multiple identities simultaneously and simultaneously for these to bubble up. Even now in our elections, we see this, right? You see that sometimes people vote on the basis of caste and community. Sometimes they'll vote on the basis of religious identity, because depending on context, what part of your identity you flex can vary.
Manu, the time period that you sort of cover in this book is quite huge, and also the geographical expanse, almost like mapping onto like the current sort of subcontinental scale. Um, and you synthesize a lot of information and sort of try to put this into a narrative. The question I had was like, I'm sure like you read much more than what you included. So what did you omit, and like what was that process of like to choose what to include and what not to include?
Yeah, that's never easy because there's so much you end up reading and so many. So I actually remember writing one section of this book. I forget which part. It's about 20 pages in the book, but my notes were 200 A4 size pages. But I simply couldn't condense all of that into that segment. But I think that's how research works. Ultimately, you have to pick and choose. There are stories that go into the narrative, but there's a lot that doesn't. It's technically a 600-page book, but over 250 pages are notes, because what I can't put in the main narrative, I dump in the notes, hoping that interested readers will still be able to find those stories and go down those rabbit holes, just as I went down those rabbit holes. But it's also, this is one of those earlier works of mine are much more granular. I go into specific stories, specific periods, and sort of investigate those. So you've got a wealth of material, and you can synthesize all of that a certain way. But as you try to write a big picture book where you have to zoom out, you're constantly battling this whole fear that am I losing a sense of nuance somewhere? In trying to sort of get that big picture, am I generalizing too much at some other point? So you have some of those fears, and you have to therefore constantly read and reread and try to sort of figure out and sort of critique your own text in order to understand whether you're flattening things, oversimplifying things, etc. And that's the only way you can ultimately make sense of it. But writing a book like this, I think if you ask any writer who tries to write a big picture book, at the end of it, what you feel is not so much satisfaction. Even though readers may enjoy the book, you still feel a bit dissatisfied. You're like, there's so much more I could have said. There's so much more I could have included. For example, one grievance a couple of reviewers have had with this book is that you talk about Hindu-Christian interactions, but where is the Muslim in all of this? But the frank truth is, even as I was doing my research, I realized that the Muslim story, frankly, deserves a separate book. Because Muslims had their own interactions with Christian missionaries. Muslims had their own interactions with Hindus. If I were to include the Muslim also into this narrative, it would have been twice the size, a 1,200-page book, which nobody would have read. Because we also live in the real world where people don't like heavy books anymore. I'm already taking a risk with a 600-pager. So you're sometimes also constrained by some practical limitations of that nature. And also the reason is you want to be coherent. And therefore, you can't flail about too much because you can't include everything in one book at the end of the day.
Would you want to share like some things that you didn't include, like?
I mean, the whole Muslim-Christian encounters. For example, so the book is called Gods, Guns, and Missionaries because its primary theme is basically people fighting over God. Is it one God? Are there many gods? Is it one God taking the form of many gods? Is there a hierarchy of gods? Whose God is real, whose is not? So that's the cultural feud that takes place between people. That's the gods in the title. Guns is a reference to colonialism and eventually also how a militant response emerges among Hindus, and they sort of create this muscular sense of identity which is now ascendant and dominant in the country. And missionaries are, of course, this fascinating, tantalizing third element of the recipe, because again, they're not a monolith. There are different types of missionaries. There's somebody, one set may come in with absolute contempt for pagan native people and completely sort of demolish whatever they believe in. Another set of people will come, but they will soon be very curious and they'll end up investing time trying to understand the stories of these people. There are these great debates that will take place between them. But the same can be said of the Muslims. So I did actually collect a lot of material where the Muslims are also engaging with the same paradoxes and contradictions of being faced by a pagan culture, whereas they believe in a monotheistic identity. How do you then convert that sense of monotheism and your religious identity with this local culture that is so diverse and so different? So they also face some of those problems, but yeah, that I couldn't cover in this book.
I did feel that, especially with like Richard Eaton's work, who talks about, I mean, you obviously talked about the idea of Islam coming to Kerala on through commercial networks, but Richard Eaton's work, where he looks at Deccan northern provinces and Bengal, like these three different regions, and how Islam spreads in diverse ways in these three regions, even attaining some sort of form of like local practices, which probably is a good read for all of you. And I like, and while you mentioned about your notes, I was really thankful that you included them. And also that this is where Manu's style of writing sort of really kicks in, is where he would write a sentence which is a PhD thesis in itself, as some of us would have read. And then he writes a sentence in ways that it would make you curious to even go, like, take the pain to, like, sort of find the book, find a note and read what he has written or who he has referred to. And I asked this question, Manu, because I also do some form of Goan history, but not the period that you look at in your first chapter. I thought, like, the first chapter where you talk about the Portuguese missionaries and some discussion around Goa, there was perhaps a sense that the native sort of actors were like sort of like passive recipients of the proselytizing sort of endeavors that the Portuguese did. So I was just wondering, like, and there is some recent scholarship that has come which is sort of trying to change that, or even you've referred to Angela's work. But would you want to sort of like talk more about
So
that?
this is where I sort of zoom out, right? Because I'm trying to also communicate that people had different responses on both sides. So when the missionaries and the Europeans first come in, they're coming from a specific worldview. So even today, to give an analogy, we have this notion of left and right in our country, right? Political ideologies. And people can be very ideological in the way they look at the past. So we live in the age of the internet. We have so many books at our disposal. And yet we find that there are people who are so ideological that they will not move from their position no matter how much evidence you throw at them. And if we today in the 21st century with all these resources can be so stubborn, you can imagine 500 years ago, people from a different culture coming into a new culture, encountering something they're not familiar with, will fall back doubly on the stereotypes and the worldview that they have. So initially when the Europeans come into India, their notion is that in their worldview, there is only one God, in a monotheistic sense of God. The way to that God is through the Bible. So de facto, everything else that is worshipped by non-Christians has to be not God. And it is not only not God, it is satanic, it is devilish. And they were convinced, therefore, that when they first came to India, that what all the local Hindus were worshipping were monsters and forms of the devil. So you see a Kali in a temple, and you're like, yeah, this ferocious being can't be God. God is loving and all of that. So God can't take this avatar. They see a Narasimha ripping open a human being, and they say, this can't be God. This has to be a monster. And that's the initial worldview they bring into the country. With the Portuguese, what you find is, because power is also with the white man in a certain pocket, again, not all of Goa, but that what you call the old conquest, in that core area where they originally dominated, they initially leave the place alone. And actually local Brahmins, etc., are cooperating with them. The administration's run by involving local Hindus, etc. But at a certain point, by the 1540s, 60s, etc., you start seeing a kind of aggressive proselytization taking place. And that's where a lot of the violence begins. Now again, things that are happening in India are not happening in a silo. They're often correlated to things happening in Europe. In Europe, the Protestant Reformation has started. The Protestants are accusing the Catholics of being bad Christians and not sufficiently Christian, having corrupted the Bible and corrupted the Christian faith. So the Catholic Jesuits and the priests and the regime in Goa almost has a double incentive to be nasty to the pagans here, to demonstrate to critics in Europe that no, look, we're very good Christians. Look at us trying to convert these people. So the two feed into each other. And there's a kind of pressure, people go into exile, there's ways in which people respond, many people convert, etc. So here you find one way in which that Christian-Hindu encounter works out. But since you mentioned the question of the local people's agency, right? I look at it through this, my whole prism is power and how power affects all of this. So you take somebody later in the early 17th century like Roberto de Nobili. So in Goa, where the power is with the white man, the state itself has a Christian sort of conception of the world, and then there's the pressure to convert. People not just have to convert to Christianity, but they're also under pressure to Europeanize. Give up your names, give up your lifestyle habits, give up your customs. You can't squat to urinate. You must, you can't have Hindu music. You must follow a different kind of music. Everything, there's a kind of Europeanization. But what happens when the missionary goes into a domain where there's no white man ruling, where the state is not under their control? So Roberto de Nobili goes to Madurai in the early 17th century. He's an Italian Jesuit. Madurai is an outpost of the Vijayanagara Empire. It's a Hindu place with a Hindu temple. Here, it is not the missionary who forces the Hindus to convert, but to woo the Hindus, it is the missionary who transforms Christianity. So here you have Christianity being, in a sense, or a westernized idea of Christianity being imposed on people in Goa. But in Madura, it's the other way around. It's Christianity that becomes Hinduized in order to cater to local people because that political power is out of the equation. So Roberto de Nobili basically starts wearing saffron robes because Hindu gurus wear saffron robes. He acquires a punul or a sacred thread like a Brahmin. Every time he converts a Brahmin, he says, you can keep your sacred thread, no problem. You're a Brahmin Christian. I'll just add a little cross to it. He becomes a vegetarian and he has his food cooked only by Brahmins. In fact, he comes back to Goa at one point to see his superiors and refuses to eat with them because he says, you're all Parangi European Christians. I am an Italian Brahmin and therefore I can only eat Brahmin cooked food out of a plantain leaf sitting on the floor. So he has all of these innovations that he brings in. The Bible is no longer presented as the Parangi Vedam or the Firangi or the white man's Vedam. It is called the Satya Vedam. And his argument is that just as you have the 4 Vedas, which are these steps on the ladder to God, think of the Bible as the 5th Veda and the final step on the ladder to God. So he's essentially transforming Christianity into a localized version of the faith. So much so that in Tamil Nadu, there are still Catholic priests who wear saffron robes, who do the tika on the forehead, who do the aarti as you do in temples. There were shrines, I don't know if they still do it, but there were shrines where, for Christian saints, where people would go and sacrifice goats just as you sacrifice goats to Kali. And this isn't a new formula. The Nasrani Christians of Kerala, who'd been Christians long before the Europeans arrived here, their Christianity was also indigenized in a way that they essentially acted as an upper caste group in a broadly Hindu society without too much variation in the way they dressed, etc. So it's only until recently, it was only 50 years ago that the cock sacrifices in the Nasrani churches stopped because people thought that wasn't any Christian anymore. But at one point it was considered perfectly fine to envision that as Christianity. The other thing is also the debates that are taking place between these people. So you find, for example, a Father Fenicio in the court of the Zamorin of Calicut in the 17th century. And initially they find that this coming and thinking that we will just convert people because we have the light of the Bible shining on them doesn't work, because the missionaries find local people have their own conception of religion. So Fenicio will then start debating Brahmins in Calicut, where he'll say things like, you have these gods like Krishna, he's running around with gopis, how can this be a god? God doesn't flirt with women. God is a very dignified person. And you have Ganapati, who's got this giant belly and the head of an elephant, and he somehow seems to commute on a rat. This doesn't add up. How can this be God? To which the Brahmins will reciprocate because they've done their homework as well. They'll say that, oh, you say Jesus was God's son, but then how could Jesus have been put up on a cross if he was God's son? That doesn't add up. You attack us for idolatry, but you have processions of the Virgin Mary. Isn't that a form of idolatry? So there's a kind of debate playing out, but at this time it's an academic debate. It's still a debate of equals happening on fairly neutral ground. These debates pick up, and one fundamental issue that the missionaries and the Hindus come up with constantly is where the missionary often insists that there is only one path to God. God has appeared, you have the Bible, and this is the only path to God. To which the Hindu respondents often respond by saying, no, God is like a shopkeeper. Just as you want to bring multiple customers to your counter, you have multiple products. God is also multiple paths because he wants to bring everybody to his counter. There's the first Protestant missionary in India, Ziegenbach, in the 18th century, goes and has a conversation with the Brahmin. He says, yours is a religion of error. And the Brahmin sort of, raises his hand like that and he says, look, God is omnipotent and all-loving. If God has given us a mistaken religion, it is because God wants us to have a mistaken religion. Why would God, put us in this situation if he had any other ideas? So God wouldn't come to you as a people and give you one book saying now it is your job to go and spread it around the world. No, God has given you the Bible as your path, but we have our path. So you constantly find that a play between tension but also playfulness. There is tension, but there's, oh, my voice sounds different suddenly. There is tension, but there's also curiosity at this time, and you increasingly find both the missionaries as well as the Hindus starting to form a sense of each other, not always flattering, but also at this juncture, one of equals, because power hasn't completely become lopsided.
Yeah, and it's probably the last question before I ask a couple of general questions about the book, was that how did you sort of come at the choice of ending the book where you end, in the rise of what we presently understand as Hindutva, where we talk about Tilak and Savarkar mainly as the patriarch ideologues of this movement. Was it something in retrospect that you thought, okay, I'll start from here and then probably switch it back into the history, or sorry, that's some divine intervention. or was it something that you thought, okay, you'll start? Was that the starting point, and then you projected back, or like, would you think, okay, let me just write and see where this goes?
See, living in the world that we live in, where Hindutva is dominant and Hindu nationalism is reshaping the country and all of that, obviously there were questions in my mind as to where does this impulse even come from? That simplistic 21 or 20-year-old's argument that, oh, Savarkar woke up one fine morning and wrote a book called Hindutva, or who is a Hindu, and that's where all of this began. It is simplistic. You find that even before Savarkar, Tilak was trying to define the word Hindutva. People in Bengal like Chandranath Basu were trying to define it. The first person to use the word, I think, is Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay in one of his texts. Yeah, he uses the word for the first time. So that word was floating around for a while, and I was trying to understand, where does the impulse come from? This kinds of muscular, defensive Hindu identity, what some would call reactionary. And I think that's what really brought me into this subject. I wrote initially as a 21-year-old, I went into it and wrote a master's dissertation many, many years ago. Then this book-to-length project began in 2019 and then got published in 2024. So it took a while to sort of get my head around this. But it wasn't necessarily to find purely a kind of justification as to why did Hindutva emerge, but more to just tackle that question. And since we were speaking about the missionaries, what the sort of genealogy I can trace, and remember there are multiple paths to this juncture called Hindutva. This is just one path that I've managed to track down. What you find is that impulse towards a muscular Hindu identity, to a great extent, while of course we now frame it in Hindu-Muslim terms, the Christian missionary, Christianity in terms of the mold of what a religion should look like, and then Hindus wanting to sort of pick up that mold and bottle Hinduism into it, that very much comes from the colonial period. So I thought this is something most people haven't looked at that much. So this is what I want to study. And that's why I think you start seeing those early sort of Hindutva impulses, a kind of proto-Hindutva emerging, especially in these dialogues with the missionaries once the British start ruling. So into the late 18th and 19th centuries, at first when the British come here, they've learned in some ways, they've seen what the Portuguese have done and what has worked and what hasn't worked. And their initial attitude is one of pragmatism. So initially when the British are here, they have no desire to meddle in religion. On the contrary, they want to stay away, and they're not only being tolerant of local Hindu traditions, they're actively endorsing and supporting a lot of it. So you find cases where British officials are going around smashing coconuts in temples. You find cases where British officials are escorting deities in temple processions. You have British officials giving grants to temples. So Thomas Munro gives a grant to the temple at Tirupati. Roose Peter gives a grant at the temple at Madurai. John Munro to the temple at Trivandrum. There's a place, after my book came out, someone emailed me saying that they come from a place called Bhavani, where there's a Devi temple, and there's a British official who donated a palanquin, a bejeweled palanquin, to which even now the deity is placed in that, and pujas are done to the deity. So you have English officials acting very much like, or attempting to imitate Hindu Rajas. When Puri is conquered from the Marathas, Wellesley, the Governor General, basically instructs the East India Company troops not to do anything that will upset the temple or its Brahmins or the local people, because the temple was so important. And the Brahmins also reciprocate. They write a Sanskrit letter to Wellesley saying that, look, till you came, we were suffering under our previous rulers, the Marathas, Hindu rulers. Now that you are here, we've been saved, and we hope forever that Puri continues under the white man's rule. They're essentially saying this in Sanskrit, because that's the terrain at that time. But slowly over a period of time, because of dynamics in Britain, where there's a growing evangelical movement, the officers here come under pressure to let in more missionaries, and now it's a more aggressive cause. Now it's mixed with that whole colonial project of civilizing the native. So the idea is that, oh, how is it that you will patronize the Brahmins, but you won't let the missionary into the country? So the first victory for the missionaries around 1813, and then by the 1830s, free access is given to the missionaries. And here you start seeing Hindu society responding in interesting ways. It's not mass-based movement, it's not articulated in the form of Hindutva, but you see some forms of resistance, which is partly a resistance to the white man and his rule, but partly also framed in a religious idiom. For instance, missionaries traveling in North India come across this phenomenon where at Ramlila performances, where you have the final flaming arrow shot at Ravana's effigy, Ravana is suddenly dressed in the clothes of the Governor General of the East India Company. And they're like, something is amiss here. Why are the Hindus shooting arrows, flaming arrows at the Governor General's effigy? Among Hindu intellectuals, now they've come face to face with Christianity. So they know that there is this entity and we have to deal with it, because the missionary is visibly around us, lecturing and sort of preaching at melas and outside temples, etc. So they have to give Christianity a place in their worldview, but they can only give a negative place in that worldview. So they come up with this story where they say that, oh, the Hindu traditions, Vaishnavism, Shaktism, all of that, Shaivism, they were doing so well and all the Hindus were being so uplifted spiritually that all the Hindu souls were landing up in Swargalokam or heaven, as a result of which hell, which is Yamalokam, had a depopulation. There was nobody in hell anymore. So this upset cosmic balance, and God being all for cosmic balance, had to now get some more people into hell to bring everything back to normal. So he created a faith called Christianity, so some souls would be waylaid into going to hell. Which, remember, the story, by the way, as a template existed earlier. When Shaivas and Vaishnavas fought each other, one of these groups said, yeah, the other religion exists so that some people can go to hell. Except that now that the missionary and the white man was there, that same template was used, but to give Christianity a certain place. By the 1840s, you find a guy called from Maharashtra, 20-something-year-old kid really, called Bhaskar Pandurang, who writes 6 rather impressive letters to the Bombay Gazette, signed a Hindu, in which he articulates perhaps for the first time in the English language a kind of critique of colonialism, where he's criticizing their economic policy, political policy, but also religion. Where he says, for example, that under Muslim rulers, if you converted to Islam, at least you would gain something. They would give you position, you would have some kind of status in the world. But under you, if we convert to Christianity, your racism will still prevent us from succeeding. So you want us to convert, but you still won't treat us like equals. So then what is the point of all of this? So here you see a kind of proto sense of muscular Hindu identity or some kind of resistance, not only to colonialism, but also to the white man and his religion taking form. This is what later Tilak and Savarkar tried to take forward. And there again, I think it's important to note their community and caste background. The Chitpavan Brahmins, which is the community from which both of these gentlemen and several other freedom fighters of the western region come, the British always viewed them with great suspicion. Because the Chitpavan Brahmins, it is a fact that by the 18th century, they fuse the ritual position of the Brahmin with political power. They're Brahmins, but they're simultaneously also warriors and kings and fighters. Not legally, but they are technically princes and rulers. So there's a kind of fusing of military activity, a sort of muscular form of identity, but also their religious position. And then they are toppled by the British, and therefore the Chitpavans of the Pune area have a major resentment towards the East India Company and the British in general. And in British records, you consistently find this refrain that the Chitpavan Brahmin cannot be trusted. This is the most seditious group of people in India. This is a group that's desperately trying to win back power, etc., etc. So, and this is the community from which Tilak, Savarkar, etc. come. If you read their collected writings, Tilak's family, Ratnagiri, Savarkar and his family background, they all have this notion of lost greatness. Oh, we were great and powerful in the Peshwa era, and now we must resuscitate or revive that sense of glory. But Tilak, when he tries to define Hindutva, essentially still frames it in a religious form. He says, oh, to be a Hindu, you must believe in the Vedas, you must worship the cow, you must believe in multiple paths to God, la la la. But the problem with that is it's not a lasting formula, because within Hinduism, you have groups like the Veerashaivas who do not venerate the Vedas. People that you numerically count as Hindus, specifically on the Dalit side of the caste spectrum, do eat beef. So then how do you reconcile that with cow worship? So Tilak's framing doesn't really pick up because he himself is conflicted and he never completely abandons caste notions himself. Savarkar is the one who, in a sense, creates that more enduring formula for Hindutva, because he essentially removes the religion from it, and he reframes it by simply saying that in order to be counted as a Hindu politically, not religiously, but politically, all you need to do is satisfy 2 conditions. One is this must be your holy land and this must be your fatherland. One condition alone doesn't work. If it's just your holy land, every Buddhist from China can land up saying that we are Hindus because this is our holy land. If it's just fatherland, then Muslims and Christians can also claim to be Hindu because they are descended from people who converted at some point or the other. So he says it has to be a fusing of fatherland and holy land. What does it do? Primarily, it allows Shaktas, Vaishnavas, Jains, Buddhists, Shaivas, etc. to come together in one grouping. Of these, only the Shakta, Shaivas, and Jains and the Vaishnavas will be Hindu parts of Hinduism. But he counts the Buddhists and the Jain also as Hindu politically. But what it leaves out is the Muslim and the Christian, which is, as he at one point says, people with their faces turned to Mecca or Rome or whatever it is. And that formula is what has survived and taken the form that we know today. So I end the book at Savarkar. Since you had asked me earlier what else I left out, initially I thought the epilogue would bring it to the present. I would talk about what's happening in the present. Then I thought, no, because if I bring in the present, then that will overwhelm the rest of the book. Everyone will only focus on what I say about the present and nobody will read the historical side of things. So I said, let me keep the cutoff at Savarkar and leave contemporary history or post-independence history out and sort of end the book with Savarkar's death.
You
I was conflicted in my mind if I should ask him this question or not before I pass the mic to the audience. But like this, just zooming out a question. You think our histories are becoming a bit more presentist and like probably a kind of diverse history writing that we could have seen had not the political moment not weighed on us? Do you think are we sort of, because in several podcasts that you said about the book is that you were worried that you would get cancelled after this book, and so far it hasn't been, but like
There's always tomorrow. But no, I was paranoid I'd get cancelled because even when I was doing my edits, I remember thinking that the introductory chapter, I'm pretty sure people on the right won't like certain parts of it, especially where you talk about how the Brahmins were constantly fusing local traditions and cults, etc., into what we now frame as Hinduism. Then I read the first chapter and I was like, oh, what if this is taken as anti-Christian because we're talking about Portuguese violence in Goa, etc., and whether there'll be people who take that personally. So I thought I'd be cancelled, but Vivek isn't here, but he was one of the first people to review the book and he seemed to have enjoyed it. Multiple reviews since then seem to suggest that people on both sides are actually reading the book as opposed to setting out to cancel me. It's also possible because it's 600 pages, they haven't got through it and the cancellation will happen soon. It hasn't happened yet, but there's still time. So I'm still keeping fingers crossed. But on your broader question, I think at some level that presentism is difficult to avoid because ultimately historians and scholars are also creatures of this time and place, which means that we are in some way or the other, whether we recognize it or not, implicitly conditioned by our own position, and therefore that somewhere affects the themes we choose to study, how we choose to study it, etc. But again, if you're trained well enough, you know how to minimize any kind of bias or any kind of presentism in your work. So you'll be able to do a book that addresses perhaps some present day concerns without letting the present get too much into the way you analyze the past. But at the same time, fully aware that this book is ultimately trying to address present day questions. But it's not an easy, it's a tightrope. It's not easy to walk this path. And I think for everybody, it's always an aspiration, but I don't think we ever succeed 100% because ultimately we are also human beings. And just as, we now critique, say, historians from 100 years ago for their limited perspectives, it's very likely that 30 years from now, some of these kids will grow up and if they become historians, they will critique our work because they realize that we are also flawed and conditioned by our own place.
Okay, with that, I open the floor for audience questions. Please raise your hand. Is there a mic that is going around in the audience? Yeah, there is.
Want to put my ass.
Okay, isn't this the mic?
Did you really mean that? Oh, this will be.
No, please. Please raise your.
What do you want? Place. Here's the thing. So,
Hello. The question is, why do you need God? Why do you need God?
Why do you need God? That's a question most people have not only been trying to address but also been fighting over for many years.
That's it. You're only fighting with each other because of different gods.
But I think human beings like to fight. This is one of those things. As a species, if you look at the broad arc of history, we are perhaps the stupidest race because we keep making the same mistakes constantly in a cycle and sort of falling into the same patterns over and over. But I'll give you an example from the book. Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who eventually goes on to attempt to become a Hindu Martin Luther and reform Hinduism, etc. One of his first writings in the Persian language, I forget the name, Tufat something, it basically is not just about, it's about religion, but he's critiquing religion as a concept itself. He's basically saying that even acknowledging that there is only one uniform supreme God, for all people in the world, God can't have created contradictory doctrines for different people. So if Hinduism says you must go to the temple and bow to the idol, Islam says you cannot worship an idol. So God can't have created these contradictory principles. Human beings have created it, which means organized religion is of human conception, and therefore organized religion, therefore he seems to suggest, doesn't have that kind of sacred validity. But 10 years later, the same Ram Mohan Roy becomes more pro-Hindu in terms of his writing, etc. Because he also realizes that it's not really about religion in an abstract sense, but religion is closely wedded to people's identities. And in a time of colonialism where he felt that Hindus had to stand up for themselves, etc., he therefore invests in that identity, even though that earlier as a young man he didn't necessarily believe in religion. Because he realizes it's not actually about God, it's about human beings and their sense of identity that matters. So in his writings, he actually goes on to even say that the current condition of the Hindus is not conducive to their political whatever. And that's why he's reforming Hinduism to create a more politically, sound form of Hinduism. So he's very aware that it's actually not about God at the end of the day. It's about human beings only.
That is the Michael. It's the Michael nation. Hopefully.
Um, so when we talk about Hindu history or history in general, what about how we see history as a sort of exclusionary practice? Like when we talk about Hinduism or any Indian history, it's a very Brahmanized perspective because, I mean, quite obviously, they are the ones who make the literature, and that is how we get our history. So, what happens to the threads of history that are sort of snapped while making this sort of Hinduized fabric, like what you said when they migrated? What about the people who are already there? How do their customs come out when we look at history?
So what you find is that as much as the text or the Sanskrit sources do have a Brahmin flavor and leaning, you also find that as Brahmins are moving around the country and bringing together these different cults and groups into one common framework, they do privilege themselves. Brahmins are always slotting things in a way that they will remain on top. Yet at the same time, the Brahmin is also transforming constantly. So no one Brahmin group in the country is same as the other. So when the Nambudhiris in their tradition, Parashurama gets them to Kerala, and Parashurama has committed matricide. He's killed his mother, and therefore he instructs the first set of immigrants into Kerala to become matrilineal. But historically, we know that there were matrilineal groups in Kerala, and it's just that the Brahmins who came in adopted a local custom to start with. So it's actually them conceding to a local tradition, but the narrative makes it seem like it was a uniform choice where they were exercising complete freedom as opposed to them adjusting to a local culture which made demands on them. Similarly, you'll find that while in the modern period, you find upper caste groups denying what are called the inferior gods, gods to whom blood sacrifices are made, animals are offered, etc. You find in earlier times, even if they were unhappy with it, they could never deny it. There was a acknowledgement that, okay, we don't like it, we will not minister to these deities, but we will permit this to continue, and they couldn't really push back against it. We have temples in this country where I come from in Kerala, where in the same temple, morning and evening pujas are done by non-Brahmin priests, but the afternoon puja is done by a Brahmin priest. And they're using different sets of rites and they're making meaning of the same idol, but in very different ways. That same deity is perceived in very different ways. But I think the problem really is that into the colonial period, especially as more and more English literature started emerging on India, etc., there was a privileging not just of the Brahmin, but the upper caste male and their version of history. Because it was primarily upper caste men going to college, it was primarily upper caste men picking up the English language, picking up this new way of how to write history in that Western sense. Earlier we had history, but it more in a sense of cultural consciousness, stories, legends, lore. But a kind of history writing that came from the West and how Indians would adapt to that was done by upper caste people of a certain background. And naturally that inflects how that history is written. That's why even today when we say that, we need more histories of women, for example, we don't just need more histories of women in history, we need more women to be writing history because they have to bring in their perspective and gaze as well. And I think, there are enough historians who are able to tease out those missing pieces, because sometimes in history, the evidence is not on what is being said, but what is being concealed and what is silent, what the record is silent on. Sometimes you find the stories in the gaps and not necessarily in what the text itself is saying.
There you go. Danny.
Good morning, I'm Miguel Braganza. First of all, I would like to appreciate the way you have dealt without emotion on topics of religion, caste, nationalism, and gender. Perhaps an idle mind is the devil's workshop, and when people had time to think, they have created a sense of identity in terms of religion or nationalism. When there were hunters-gatherers, I don't think there was religion. So whether the creation of God is man's creation because of a need for an identity, what are your views?
I think man, obviously, of course, men and human beings do want identity, but I think if you look at it in that fundamental sense, what you couldn't understand and what you feared is perhaps where the original gods emerged, right? So both positive and negative. So even if you look at India, we have gods who are given negative attributes. We have gods of smallpox and disease and things like that. Alakshmi. If you have every Lakshmi, you have an Alakshmi also, who's not worshipped or anything, but there is that concept. But then, of course, there's the positive God, there's the sun God, there's this, that. But as societies also evolve, as things change, as people move from tribal groups into, say, what we call, in quote, civilized society, etc., with more trade, this and that, these notions of all God also keep changing constantly, as they're changing in front of our eyes even now. Even now we have temples where, say, 100 years ago, there used to be blood sacrifices, but now those gods have been Brahmanized and now milk and honey is offered to them as opposed to blood sacrifices. In Kerala, where I come from, you see gods who used to get animal sacrifices, but now you sacrifice cucumbers because that cucumber represents the animal. So as society and its own notions evolve, that sense of God also evolves. So I think it's linked very much to, of course, seeking identity, but human beings will always, I think, need some kind of they'll be drawn emotionally to some idea of some kind of higher power, irrespective of how sophisticated, etc. we get. In fact, that's another thing covered in this book, which is about how when Western education came into the country, and there was a hope among certain missionaries at that time that, oh yes, Western science will open their eyes and they will realize idolatry is bad, that religion is bad, or their religion is bad at least, and that people will be primed to convert because Western science will come and demolish their traditional beliefs. But in reality, no. You'll find that actually local people find a way to get science to sit alongside their religion without any contradiction. So even when, for example, a few years ago, I think the ISRO chief went to a temple before a big, rocket took off or whatever, and people were like, how can you do this? If you look at it historically, people have always done this. They are always able to do it. Even the missionaries, hoping that science would demolish local traditions, the original rationalists of the Enlightenment thought science would demolish Christianity in Europe, but that didn't happen. Instead, the Christians thought that, we can actually own science and use that as a weapon against so-called pagan cultures. So everybody adapts constantly, and religion also keeps adapting constantly. The idea of God also keeps adapting constantly.
Last two questions, I think, ma'am here. And we can probably take the questions together and Lena, okay. Okay. Yeah, we'll answer together. So,
My question was about. Okay, sorry.
there's a lady. Yeah, there's a lady waiting here. Please. Yeah, please ask your question.
Yeah. So when did this battle of Hindutva in the 19th century become a battle with Islam and the Indian Muslim by the time Savarkar came on the scene? Because Savarkar also had some kind of a friendly alliance with the British.
The other question, and then I'll answer both.
My question was about Ambedkar, who strangely remains almost like a footnote in your book. Along with that are the other ideas of, which are enshrined in the ideas which enshrine in the preamble of the Constitution of liberty, fraternity. Where does that figure in the modern Hindu?
So the liberty, the constitutional thing doesn't really come into the book, and that was a conscious thing because the book is covering an earlier period, an earlier set of impulses. On Ambedkar not being there, actually the thing is, I can't see you suddenly. Okay, I initially decided to go with Phule, and I've actually covered Mahatma Phule in the book rather than Ambedkar. And in a sense, Phule is Ambedkar's precursor. In some ways, Ambedkar did see Phule as a kind of guru. So to encapsulate the ideas that Ambedkar would of course make more sharply later, chronologically, as my narrative built up, it made more sense for me to focus on Phule and get those impulses covered through Phule and then come to the Savarkar bit later, rather than then again rounding back to Ambedkar, because it felt that structurally it might get a bit repetitive. Because much of what Ambedkar says, you can see the seeds of that already in Phule. And Phule was a very vocal critic of this newly forming Hindu identity that also had a Brahmanized tone to it, and he was a very polemical writer about it. So I've covered that in the book. So that's the answer on the Ambedkar question. Your question was on, this is what happens when you take multiple questions.
On the
enmity with Muslims. So that's the other thing in the book. People said, why don't you talk about how the Muslim becomes like the main thing? I do, but you see, so the book makes 2 points. One is that modern Hinduism as an ism, as opposed to a much more fluid, amorphous substance and identity earlier, essentially takes that shape by imitating the Christian idea. So even when Ram Mohan Roy wants to reform Hinduism, he's borrowing a Protestant mold for the Hindu religion. So just as the Protestants claim there was Christianity originally, it was corrupted by the Catholic Church, and then the Protestants reformed it. Ram Mohan Roy says there were the Upanishads earlier, it got corrupted into temple worship, I will reform it and we'll go back to the Upanishads. So he's borrowing that mold. But the moment where the Muslim comes in is actually in the second half of the 19th century, when you have this phenomenon called the census really picking up, where you suddenly start enumerating people, and identity is no longer just identity in an abstract sense, but an enumerated identity. Now suddenly people are aware that the British are going around counting people, and you have a sense that, oh, 80% of this country belongs to one particular bracket, and the other 20% or 18 or 14 or 15% belongs to this other bracket. Where earlier you may not have had that kind of enumerated sense of who and how many and what kind of political power they have. And subsequently, gaining power in the country, even under the British and subsequently after independence, depends on the logic of numbers. And ever since then, when this majority minority came in, that's when this idea of communalism begins. This is not to say there weren't Hindu-Muslim tensions before. You know, all the way back to the initial Islamic invasions and so on, you do find that there are tensions as well as syncretic tendencies. Both exist simultaneously. As I said, in Eknath's Hindu-Turk Samvad, they take pot shots at each other. They part as friends, but they also take pot shots at each other. So both impulses exist at the same time. With Savarkar, etc., with the Hindu identity sort of borrowing Christian templates to assert itself a certain way, and then with this logic of numbers coming in, they realize that culturally the other against whom they will work is the Muslim, and that is then communalism as we know it acquires a life of its own, and the Muslim becomes the primary enemy, and the missionary is sort of put on the back burner.
Just
Okay. I think I can safely say that this hall has never been more packed. I think short of sitting in each other's laps, we would not have been able to admit a single other person. Thank you so much, Manu and Kaustubh, for this absolutely brilliant session. And may I request all of you who want books autographed, or if you want to ask Manu anything, to please do it outside the hall, because the next session begins in 3 minutes and we have to get the place ready for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Right.